I credited Stephen Miller for one tiny part of what he said the other day on Fox about Greenland was that the Arctic has become the number one sort of territory for concern of the global great powers, China, Russia, and the United States. And he's right because of global warming. What I tweeted and wrote was, hooray, at least on that front, it looks like he read our series from 2005 and understands the Arctic is an opening terrain. It's not just nuclear submarines under the ice anymore. By the way, the other backstory for sure is about the minerals. They're close associates of Trump, people who are in the administration who are now working at a company called GreenMet, GREENMET. Just Google for GreenMet and the last name Horn, Horn, and Trump, and you'll see that this guy, they were already in Greenland a year ago on the ground looking at these deposits and now with a vested interest in getting those minerals.
Hi, welcome back to Code Green, Conversations for a Future We Want and Our Kids Deserve. I am pleased and honored to have an old friend, climate warrior, and fellow journalist, turned blogger, on with us today to talk about the year under Trump. This week marks the first anniversary. Well, we knew it was going to be bad, but I don't think either one of us or anybody could have known just how much they were ready to attack our Earth, nature, health, people, planet. But it's only 1 year in. I don't know how we get through 3 years of this and have anything left. It's already, the scorched earth policy. But we're going to talk to Andy about it because he's written a couple of articles. He is a former New York Times reporter. He had a wonderful blog called Dot Earth for quite a few years, and now does a fabulous webcast called Sustain What, which I suppose is sustainability. What does that mean? And he's also a fabulous musician. And if you don't know his work, please follow him because he's right on top of it. He's got the distinction of having done this longer than I have, reported on climate and environment, and I'm going on year 29. But we're both somehow still young. I say our passion keeps us young. Without further ado, how you feeling, Andy?
Well, pretty frazzled, although I guess when you've been at this long enough, also, there is a sense of just getting up in the morning and keeping at it, as opposed to feeling paralyzed. I never feel paralyzed. And what I'm trying to do is look at the landscape in what is essentially the equivalent of an extreme storm, but in this case, it's geopolitical, not bioclimatic.
Mm-hmm.
And so you look at where's the biggest stresses? What are the things he's done? Is there anything he's done that can possibly have a positive impact? And I'd say on a couple of fronts that's true.
Environmentally or otherwise?
Yeah. Well, partly it depends on your opinion on nuclear power and also on geothermal energy, because they're redoing the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. The changes there I see as very positive.
Mm-hmm.
It takes time. Nuclear plants, a new generation of nuclear plants are not just going to spring up. They're not like solar panels and batteries, which you can install in mass.
They're also a little more dangerous if they have a spill versus a solar spill.
Well, yeah, and there you can we'll save that for another day. The debates about the relative risk of different things.
Yeah.
So there's that, and just sort of reducing some of the regulatory burden on actually any kind of infrastructure for energy. I think there's a prospect of that having some benefits.
Why do you think, sorry if I can just interrupt for a second, why is it that Republicans only ever like nuclear as a renewable energy? Is it because it's industry and there's profits to be made versus solar, geothermal, wind? Because it's 100% been my experience.
I think that's true. Probably because it's big, right? It's big energy. You and I are not going to install like a heat pump version of a nuclear power plant. We have heat pumps here in our house in Maine.
We do, yeah.
And actually, a little bit of an issue with our hot water heat pump because the drain is freezing.
Oh no, you're in Maine, I should say, in the middle of almost the end of January, so you're chilly.
Yeah, it's
you
cold.
need heat. You need heat.
But we have found heat pumps here definitely work 90% of the time.
Mm-hmm.
It's a great option.
Well, you wrote a couple of articles. I just want to, we'll continue, but that I said I got to get Andy on because I've been trying to think of who would be the best person to talk about the year in review 2025. And there's just so many hits. They just kept coming and they're continuing seemingly. Our untethered rogue president is the top danger on the planet. And I just
Yeah.
saw a similar panel on MSNBC the other day saying the national emergency is preventing the national emergency that is Trump. And everything is security, security, and they use that to justify killing windmill projects that are almost finished. Oh my God. And then Greenland, China's coming, Russia's coming, but
Yeah.
the head of Greenland and Denmark don't see those ships in the immediate area. So when I
Yeah.
saw this article and you were very pointed, I highly recommend people go read it. And then the one just prior on Greenland, what's going on? What's that really about? Because you were an expert on the Arctic. You went, I believe, to the North Pole
And to
and
Greenland.
to Greenland, and I went
Yeah,
to
the
Antarctica.
Arctic.
So we got the poles covered.
Yeah.
So you really know a lot about this. You did a four-part series for the New York Times about the Arctic. And so I just thought you're the perfect person. So thanks for making yourself available. Now, jump in. Tell me what you're thinking, what you're feeling.
Well, on Greenland, he's been at this for since his first term to a certain extent. And there have been decades earlier, there's been interest in the United States in doing something about Greenland. But none of that felt like it was going anywhere except a thought experiment until this term, these last months, where actually since last year, since his inauguration, when he really started to push this idea. And it's pretty clear now to the world that he's serious. It's also clear that this is not in his brain. This is not some strategic geopolitical thing. As the New York Times interview with him, that staff sit down they had with him, he said it's psychologically better to have ownership of something than to have like a contractual relationship with something, like a treaty, like the 1951 treaty we have with Denmark over Greenland. He needs psychologically to own it. And that Times reporter, one of them asked him, "Do you mean the American psychology or yours?" And he said, "Mine." He said,
What are you going to do? His
"Mine."
real estate portfolio? Why
Yeah,
not?
yeah. I mean,
Trumpland, not Greenland.
and sure, I understand that. I'd rather own something if I really cared about it.
I
But so
think
none of this has to do. And then you have the Stephen Millers of the world just coming up with all these arguments. Partially, I credited Stephen Miller for one tiny part of what he said the other day about on Fox about Greenland, was that the Arctic has become the number one sort of territory for concern of the global great powers, China, Russia, and the United States. And he's right, because of global warming.
yeah, okay. So I
So what
agree.
I tweeted and wrote was, hooray! At least on that front, it looks like he read our series from 2005 and understands the Arctic is an opening terrain. It's not just nuclear submarines under the ice anymore.
So maybe that's why he's trying to hasten global warming so they can get the minerals where minerals
Yeah,
may.
and that, by the way, the other backstory for sure is about the minerals. Trump, they're close associates of Trump, people who are in the administration who are now working at a company called GreenMet, GREENMET. Just Google for GreenMet and the last name Horn, HORN, and Trump, and you'll see that this guy, they were already in Greenland a year ago on the ground looking at these deposits, and now with a vested interest in getting those minerals. And
Do you
and
buy that China and Russia are threats? I mean, imminent threats? Sorry, I didn't
no,
mean to interrupt.
no, no, no. In fact, if you look at the map of the Arctic, the place where China has been doing, and China and Russia did joint exercises off of Alaska, off of the Aleutian Islands. So if you really care about China and Russia and the United States and security, you should be looking to the West. You can't even really talk about West when you're talking about the Arctic, because you're at the top of the world.
Mhm.
Look toward that Alaska, Russia area, the Bering Straits, and you could see just as much of a concern as you might see in Greenland.
I have that exact quote, I think. He said, a feeling of ownership is psychologically important to me. Okay. And that
Right.
reminded me of another unbelievable quote from him recently when he was asked, I think it was a New York Times reporter, is there any limit to what you think your powers are? And
Right.
he said, only my morals. Okay, so now we can all
Yeah,
be
I
easier.
know. Morality, yeah, only, and it's my morality. Oh boy. So we're in deep doo-doo, on that
We are.
front.
And I blame everyone who voted for him because it's no secret who he was for the first time. Living in New York during the 80s when I worked for CBS Network, I knew he was crazy and dumb. So I don't know. And after the first term, and now I have one MAGA person in my life, a second cousin, and We do spar wars, texting, and no matter what I say and what I send him, just on climate alone, doesn't
Yeah.
change. Well, I don't like everything he does, but blah blah blah.
Yeah,
Israel
no, I know.
and loves
I
nuclear, of course, nuclear.
yeah, well, here in Maine, Maine, you talk about purple states and red and blue. Maine is speckled. It's like a Jackson Pollock painting. Like you could have someone literally next door who's a hardcore blue and hardcore red, as we do. So we deal with these divergent views of the same data every day here.
Having
It-
survived 7 years in Texas Hill Country, I know what you
oh
mean.
yeah, right.
We had a war during the election. Who had a bigger sign? Neighbors got a big Trump sign. We got my favorite one, BYEDON, by Don. Biden, Biden. Remember that one?
Yeah,
Yeah, where I live in California, normally the Bay Area doesn't matter because everyone's voting Democratic, pretty much, not
yeah. I
everybody.
mean, on the voting front, I don't think it's determinative, but I know enough Democrats who were not voting at all because of issues. There's particular issues, whether it was Gaza
Mhm.
or the fact that Biden and or Kamala, disappointed them in their climate policy. There's some concern there too, and the way hyper progressives on the climate beat in the climate arena made decided to make climate a key issue, even in states like Pennsylvania, where you if you do that, you're basically undercutting your broader argument. Matty Iglesias got punished recently for writing a commentary where he said progressives should. He didn't say embrace oil and gas, but at least accept the idea that oil and gas are part of the next few decades.
Mhm.
And the inability to accept that complexity, I think harmed. You can never point to a single cause of an election result,
Oh, let's pivot to
but it's in there.
politics in general, beyond Trump or before Trump, or if there is an after Trump.
Yeah, well,
Um,
yeah, and I think we should
it-
focus on
yeah,
what
yeah.
do we do now as
Yeah, yeah,
opposed
yeah.
to
We'll get to that, I promise. But you
litigating.
touched on a really important point. Look at his climate act, the IRA that has
Yeah,
somehow got passed, 386 billion, which Trump is now clawing back, which is insane. We'll get to that.
yeah.
But neither Kamala or Biden promoted the Climate Act enough or talked about climate change enough. And that's true for a lot of Democrats. And that's why I got disenchanted. And, shouldn't that be a leverage issue and an opportunity to educate the public about just how dire and urgent this is? And only one party gets it and is trying to do something. And whatever the Democrats do, it's much better than the Republicans have ever done and will ever do.
Well, in theory that's logical, but in the sort of practical reality of politics, it's still not an issue beyond the sort of tertiary, or even what's the word for beyond tertiary?
Marginal.
Yeah, yeah, it's really marginal, except in a few places, and none of the places where it was marginal, where it was higher, are places with a that were tippable in the election.
But isn't part of that because our leaders are not talking about it enough, those who get it, right? It's like what comes
I
first?
Well, think about this. You remember Biden was trying to say, "Oh, the economy is much better than you think."
Mhm.
Isn't saying, "Oh, the climate is much worse than you think." Isn't that kind of the same thing? You're trying to convince people, and they're living in an air conditioned house, and they're not in one of the fire zones in California, and they get through the day, and they're worried about rising gas prices, and you're saying, "No, you need to worry about climate change."
But
The,
extreme weather in all its ugly forms is happening more and more across the country and across the world if you keep up with the news.
it depends on your what you're talking about. And I've written a lot about this. Not every kind of extreme weather is changing in a way that's attributable to global warming.
But it puts it on
Coastal
steroids.
hazards because of rising seas,
Mhm.
yeah. But if you look at what happened at Asheville with the deteriorating Hurricane Helene, that was a rare event. It was there. That area has had that kind of devastating damage. In 1791, 1917, they had epic rains that caused epic damage, and the rivers are actually more apt to flood severely now because of more encroachment of development.
Well,
So saying that's a climate emergency, it's a vulnerability emergency, which I've written a lot. But it's if you try to make the argument that we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to limit the possibility that Asheville, North Carolina is going to flood in the future. You're missing the
So
key
no,
elements.
no one specific event can be automatically definitively tied to climate change. But if one just looks at the hurricanes, as I call them, the infernos, I live in California, friends have lost homes, friends in the LA fire lost their
Yeah,
homes.
sure.
These are historical events. And the signature, as I say, is we've never seen anything like this before. So it's weather on steroids. I mean,
Well, but here, I'm sorry to, this is
I
where I
know
would
you're
disagree with
much more
you.
conservative than I am, but go
No,
ahead.
I've actually reported on this for 40 years,
I
and
know I've been
and
following
I've
you.
reported on every aspect of the science, and that means the geography, meaning where people live and how
Mhm.
they build their houses, as well as
Yeah,
what's happening with the climate
yeah.
and forests. California. Just reading, there's another really important study about the enormous fire deficit that still exists there. That fires are baked into that system, they've been suppressed for a century there. And what happened in Palisades, the tragedy of Palisades, which absolute tragedy, was so much more about structural fire than about anything related to climate change. One house
But
burned the next house, burned the next house.
okay,
And
so
you had shingle roofs, you had grandfathered houses. Most of that area didn't have to hew to modern fire standards for building codes. So that
but
was just like a pile of tinder just sitting there waiting to burn.
but a lot of that is from the drought, and so things are,
No, no, I'm talking about the houses themselves.
but okay, but the fire itself spreading so quickly. Living in California, growing up, we never had 80-mile-an-hour winds, 100-mile-an-hour winds. That's why it just torches and moves so quickly. Climate change didn't start the fire. I guess it was reportedly arson, but it's the spread that overwhelms, seasoned
Yeah, yeah.
firefighters,
Well, I don't want to get too bogged down on this
right?
either.
Okay.
No, the vulnerability and the fuel load in the houses, like Stephen Pine at Arizona State, who's like the world's leading fire historian. He describes situations like that as, and in Colorado too, where I wrote about it. You essentially, when you build a community like that, you're moving a forest worth of wood and making stuff out of it. So it's like a forest sitting there waiting to burn. That those structures are not going to burn more or less because of drought or not drought. They're going to burn because of they're burnable.
And the interface of humans and wildlife, humans forever encroaching into wildlands, what were wildlands,
Right.
with urban sprawl. And that even has a component to COVID cause. A lot of people don't even
Yeah.
understand that.
And
Uh,
the shortage of urban housing in
right.
California. This came up in the Bay Area, Paradise, that horrible fire. The
Yeah.
reason people moved there was because they couldn't afford to live closer
Exactly.
to
And
cities.
we just opened escrow this morning on a home to be near to our kids up in Petaluma from Marin,
Mm.
not too far, just a half an hour away. We have bought too many homes in the course of my 32-year marriage. I don't know why, but we've moved around a lot. We've never had problems getting fire insurance, and we couldn't get fire insurance. So
Yeah.
that is new, and that is climate change. That's not coincidental, right? I don't know
Well,
what
it's
people
also
do.
commerce. The insurance industry is making decisions. In California, by ordering, they're mandating levels of fire insurance for, in areas that shouldn't be insurable.
But and can you blame them given the damages that I mean, all these people
Oh, no,
losing
I
their
agree.
homes.
No, it absolutely.
But there's got to be a solution. It just so happens my husband was in the service, so we have USAA, so they gave
Yeah.
us a recommendation. They're not doing property insurance anymore. That is new. But what do other people do who maybe don't have that alternative? How do it's got to
Yeah.
affect the housing market if you can't get insurance for your property.
Absolutely. Well, this is where the concept of managed retreat comes in. It's mostly been seen in the context of coastal retreat,
Mhm.
the sea level rise, but it has to be in forest areas too.
So we'll get to some of Trump's top hits, but because we both have a media background, journalism background in corporate media, you at the New York Times, me at CBS. What do you think of the coverage of climate change? I write about that a lot. I think you have touched on that in some of your interviews on Sustain What, because I think it's abysmal. I think it's a dereliction of duty, media malpractice, as I say. They think they're covering it, but it's minimal. And then it's Epstein files all day and night, and then it's Venezuela. I'm talking about the networks mostly, cable
Yeah,
news.
sure.
And now it's Greenland. And guess what's not getting covered, as the planet melts, burns, and it's so there are other issues, but they're related. People thought price of eggs, groceries, and some of us knew that food prices are not going to come down that easily, that it's related to some of the extreme weather causing crop damage and maybe some supply shortages left over from COVID. It's much more complicated than any one president, Trump waving a wand, and all of a sudden the price of eggs is going to go down. Uh, those dots are not connected enough by mainstream media, in my view.
It's been it's a really tough challenge. If you think about any sort of incremental driver of risk, um, in this case, climate change, along with the other aspects of what happens when you have a weather disaster, it's always like the third or fourth paragraph
Exactly.
because it is, the thing you first is what happened, how many houses burned.
Right.
The second might be, well, what started it, or was there? Then you get into the causes, and in a perfect world, I think the media would start with a frame about risk. What are the drivers of risk ahead of an event, and then what are the drivers of loss after the event? And when you do that, you can have a cogent conversation that doesn't um, immediately get everyone into their corners to
Mhm.
fight
Mhm.
because you're saying, well, I guess we could pick Palisades again and say, well, catastrophe, here's the damage, and the this community had deep vulnerability, and climate change has intensified some of the other
Exacerbates.
damage.
Yes. Yes.
But how do you do that in a way that fits the first 3 seconds or the first 50 words?
And
I
I'm sure
don't
you,
know. I don't know. And I think some of the answers are extra journalistic. I was excited at first when I saw Zillow and Realtor.com and everyone starting to put climate risk factors into real estate listings. That seemed really smart, and it was getting people's attention right
Mhm.
where
Mhm.
they're looking, not necessarily feeling like they're being fed, some narrative. And now some problems have come up with that. I don't know if
Well,
you've seen the
the
recent
real
Google.
estate industry, they thought that's killing home sales. Get rid of it. But
Yeah,
apparently, I think Redfin and some of the other ones are still putting that in, making it available. But you have to kind of read the fine print. You have to
and
maybe
there are
click
some
down a
there
bit.
there are some disputes about the data. Some folks are there are these, and this is where you get into the wonky science, where scientists are like piranhas. They'll always dive in for that little piece of exposed meat.
Well,
And so here we are in the media, and there at every level of an issue like this, you'll see scientific debate that's not manufactured. It's not false balance. That's actually scientists saying, in my little corner of this question, there are real issues. And the same thing with the data on fire, on like flood loss. There are legitimate questions there, which then lead to the audience sort of pulling back and losing faith and losing engagement, and that frustrates the hell out of me.
well, just going back because this was my lived experience this week. I didn't think that the home that we're buying, if all goes well, was in a high fire danger. Why? Because it's not like surrounded by a forest or a lot of trees. There's some, landscaping and brush, but some distance between the houses, empty lot on one side, part of a farm. Um, so it's not like, and there's not houses right next to each other. They said it's in the grasslands. Well, about a mile away, there is a state park, open territory.
Yeah,
Then grasslands. It's not that thick. I mean, it's in the summer, it's like brown, arid grass. And now it's because we've had a lot of rain, very green, very long. So it doesn't seem, I mean, fire hazard relative, but like really, if this is a fire hazard zone, high risk, everything
yeah,
is because certain areas, so many areas. Anyway, so we'll
yeah.
we'll get let's move a little bit to the media. We've touched on it, but I feel strongly, and anyone who's following me knows probably too strongly, very vocal about the fact that, when I went back to the networks I used to work for and had been developed an expertise on these issues, they said they're covering it, which they were not, just barely. They don't want, they don't, yeah, they hired, a few climate correspondents. CBS's now climate correspondent is gone. We could talk about what's going on with the media,
Hmm.
right-wing influence. That's probably another story for another day. But they haven't had dedicated coverage, ongoing. If I've done 5,000 interviews on every aspect of green issues, who am I? What's my budget compared to CNN or,
Right.
MSNBC? There's so much to talk about, and it's not one environment. It's all the issues and all the angles of it. I don't know about you, but I've never run out of ideas or people to interview. Why are they doing such a really poor job, anemic job. Mostly I'm talking about the news networks. And then when Fox is still lying about climate change, say, ah, it's a big hoax. And then you hear Trump say it's a big hoax, which is insane, especially in the middle of climate week. I don't know if you were in New York, but oh yeah,
Yes.
really? It's a giant hoax, green scam. We can all go home, guys. Let's go. Tens of thousands of climate experts in town for this. Okay, maybe we should get back to Trump. I don't know. Whatever you want, take your pick.
No, no, no. Well, the media challenge is a big one. There are entities like Covering Climate Now, which are trying to train reporters to structure stories more effectively. There are entities like Climate Central, which offers visual widgets for heat records in your town, or so that anyone in the media at any level, a local weather forecaster can have content that they can pull together.
I think they're trying to pick up some of the slack of all the cutbacks
Yeah,
as
well,
far as
actually, Climate
information.
Central, they literally are recreating the disaster database that the federal government has stopped
And,
updating.
and okay, okay, one thing, eliminating the words climate change from all these government agencies and documents. Just how nuts is that?
It's
As
crazy.
if we don't talk about it, it'll go away, right? Nothing to see
No,
here.
and then I mean, we are in a superstorm. We still are. It's still unfolding. It's the early stages of it. We're in 2016, and that was just their practice run. And he pulled together a much more effective team for round two, and a lot of then he acquitted or he pardoned the Bannons of the world who are externally facilitating amplifying the same message.
Flood the
I think
zone so they don't even know what's going on.
well, and the good news is I think there's some simplistic descriptions of decarbonization trends are still progressing. The world's not recarbonizing. It's still heading toward a less carbon intensive future, largely because of China. And that U.S. presidents have much more constrained influence on that than they do on something like whether you want to attack Greenland.
Well, because of the fossil fuel industry, is that what this is all about? And they care more about power and money than their kids and
Well,
grandkids?
yeah, but the critical minerals in Greenland are about renewable energy. They're for batteries. They're also for weapons.
Are we going to
They're
give
they're
them, are
for
we going to give them credit if they invade Greenland for that?
yeah. No, no. This is not the way it should work, of course. But
This would be funny, Andy, if it wasn't so dangerous, right?
oh, I know. Yeah.
It's exhausting. It is
I guess
exhausting.
what I would say is on the reporting side of things, journalists just have to keep focused on what is happening, what can happen, on especially the local journalism, which is hurt, hurting the most right now because just basic, simple economics. There are all these newspapers and now radio stations because of public radio are kind of imploding. What you can do locally is make sure people understand where they can get a heat pump or the like. The heat pump here in Maine, there are still incentives for some of these things through Maine efficiency. Maine has its own efficiency project, and many other states do. So making sure people understand what's still doable for your own, especially in a world of rising electricity prices right now, a country facing
Oh,
that.
yeah, that's the other thing. Energy prices are not going to go down. And with all the
No,
need for more energy, electricity for AI, which they're pushing, of course,
right.
and cyber this and crypto that, to kill solar and wind projects, and the tax credits go away in July. Most people aren't even aware of that. It's so counterintuitive and counterproductive. You can't have one without the other. You can't say
It does.
full systems go on AI development, but we're going to give you less energy that's affordable.
Yeah, at least on that front, the courts seem to be siding with the wind
Yes,
developers. There are
yes,
three last week. There were three
yes.
different court decisions, federal court.
A little bit of hope, a little bit
Yeah,
of
and
sunshine.
so that's some of these institutions have not been completely demolished yet, and the courts are still a critical part of what can constrain the irrational parts of the Trump agenda.
And speaking of rational, Ian Bremmer's Eurasia Group, he's not a flaming left-wing
No,
radical. His quote of the week was that the three top political risks are Trump, Trump, and Trump. Are you heartened that some people who normally people or entities would be a little more measured are speaking out and saying, WTF? And do you think that will matter?
I think it's starting to matter. This happens with legislators where in Congress you'll see like our Senator Susan Collins, the Republican, who we're trying to dislodge from office here. We're fans of Graham Plattner, who's a neighbor. Um, but there are people like her who are making the right noises right now, and Murkowski and Tom Tillis. There's a growing number of senators who are saying Trump's crazy when it comes to foreign policy.
Mhm.
Whether that reaches the threshold of becoming, there was a vote. There was one vote in the Senate that seemed to be saying you for a particular constraint on war powers. So there can be, but as you get to that threshold of where someone's vote is the definitive one, that's where it always has fallen apart under Trump. But I think there will be a tipping point. I'm not a fan of tipping points as a construct, but they do exist, and I
Yeah,
think
the
there'll be a
coral just passed one tipping point. Go ahead.
well, right, but I think there'll be a political tipping point where this calculation, depending on pressure, depending on what happens to this the midterms, you could see finally enough Republicans getting a spine to say we're going to start moving toward whether it's JD Vance or whatever the next thing is. And I'm in the mode of let's deal with that problem when we
Right. Yeah.
when we
If we
can.
get if we're around.
Yeah, exactly. Let's get whatever gets us beyond where we're at now. It feels like a reasonable thing
Whenever I hear
to
Trump
push.
referred to as a lame duck, it's like, well, don't tell him that because he'll just get worse.
Yeah, I on Pod Save America yesterday, the pundits were saying he's a new thing. He's a lame duck dictator. The world has never seen that before. He's a dictator who's got a time certain when his time ends, except for death, and
But
that's an
he
interesting
has
concept.
grandchildren. Is there just no connecting of all the Republican legislators too? How can they not, just on climate alone?
Not even on, I mean, on issues that are more central uh, to their, like Rand Paul. I think he's one of the ones who's standing firm on foreign policy at least, and
Yeah.
um, but even he, they still have not gone to the threshold of saying this is enough. We need to, whether it's convincing the cabinet to go for a 25th Amendment. Good luck with
Yeah.
that. Given the cabinet is all his cronies.
And yet there's more evidence every day that that really might be appropriate.
Well, and this is where who knows what the backstory will be, whether his successors will finally say he's done what they wanted, he's broken the system, now they get to take over.
And we
It's
haven't even
it's
talked about ICE because it's not really in the green zone, but what a
yeah.
tragedy and how outrageous that they're accusing this dead woman of it was her fault and leftist communist or whatever they
Well,
call her.
there too, there are, one thing that before the election in last October, November, I did a webcast on immigration because migration is a big part of
Oh, yes.
sustainability,
Thank you. Yes.
right? And I was casting about for some folks to get on the call, and because I'm still on Twitter, which is hard, but is to be
I'm
useful,
not.
I found there's a guy named David Beer, Bier, who's the top immigration migration expert at the Cato Institute. Now, you probably recall Cato is not the friend of climate policy, right? That's where Pat Michaels used to hang out.
Mhm.
But the libertarian philosophy has a strong pro-immigration stance, and this is why I try really hard not to be a single issue thinker. I wouldn't normally look to Cato for insights on anything, but I found David Beer, his policy, his arguments on migration, on how to deal with immigration.
Does he mention climate change as a factor for some people
No,
having
but
to
we're not.
think?
It's not really. No, not at that
No,
level. It's all
it never,
about
it hardly ever
the
is mentioned.
freedom of movement. Freedom of movement is part of being an actualized human being,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
and so that's the libertarian angle. And so he's been fighting fiercely on social media and other places against what ICE and Trump have been doing. And I had him on the show, and it was fantastic. And to me, that having him there
Mhm.
helps me connect with people who might even have voted for Trump, but who would be saying, "Oh wow, Cato, oh Cato's for not for open borders, but for, a reasonable immigration
Maybe there's
policy.
some common ground you're saying. Yeah, well,
Yeah,
that
then
makes
you
for
can,
interesting
you,
conversations.
it breaks down these sort of brittle divides that people kind of think are all in one. You're either in that divide entirely or you're on the other side entirely. And when I see someone like that at a place like Cato, it really excites me.
Well,
Um,
what enrages me most is, the hypocrisy of being so tough on immigration, just what they're doing, all the crackdown, ICE, horrendous, while at the same time not ever acknowledging that climate change, which they're also trying to pretend doesn't exist, is a factor. It's not the only factor for a lot of people from the South trying to, they can't grow crops there. They can't get work. It's too hot. I mean, that's never mentioned, right? It's the hypocrisy of, gun control. Well, it's not guns, it's the people, it's mental illness, but then they cut back on funding mental health. You can't have both
oh
ways.
yeah, no, I know.
But that's just me.
It's not just you. um,
Well, I'm
so I
almost out of,
guess
go ahead.
this is just one of those wake up in the morning, put one foot in front of the other kind of moments where the level of uncertainty on how bad this can get is, I think the certainty that it can get really bad is much higher than it used to be. I'm talking
Well,
about geopolitical,
yes.
with climatic, the climate issue. I've actually said this. One reason on my Substack on Sustain What, I've been focusing more and more on things like how to get out of authoritarian governance,
Mhm.
and how to deal with misinformation, along with climate, is
Disinformation
you
is a big
can't
problem.
have any prospect of reasonable climate and energy policy if you don't have more of a truly democratic representative system.
If
So
it's hard,
it
and with AI, it's going to be hard to tell what is true, what is
and
false.
well, right, and yeah, I'm doing a show this Friday on this, and what I would like to see a little bit more from some of my climate hyper focused friends is
Mhm.
getting to that high level reality that if you want cogent climate policy, you can keep doing your blog about batteries, but are they going to be ubiquitous in America? That needs policy. And so if you're not focusing on governance and the sustainability of democracy, all of your climate communications are not going to really amount to much.
Well, let's end on an optimistic note because the resistance is growing day by day. We're seeing it
Yeah.
in the streets. There was just some walkouts for the first year anniversary of the inauguration. And at least where I am now, out of Texas in Northern California, there's a lot of indivisible, a lot of activity. And here's what I say to my Trumpy cousin. Well, watch out because whether or not you see it, every time Trump opens his mouth, every time he does something, he's alienating another group of Americans. And that has to add up, hopefully reflected in the midterms.
Yeah. And then, we can get back to talking about
Real problems, real
well, they're all
emergencies.
they're all real problems, but talking about the how do you accelerate the clean energy transition, and the like.
Mhm. Well, with this post, we'll put how people can reach you. And I hope you'll subscribe to Code Green, you, Andy, and everybody watching. If
I
you go to
rather
YouTube,
like the name, by the way, Code Green.
thank you.
We
I've
talk
done,
too much about Code Red.
thank you. I've had different names from Trash Talk 28 years ago to Eco Talk to the Green Front to Meet the Solutionaries. And some people like it, some don't. Trash Talk really got like strong reactions both ways. Code Green is the first one where everybody likes it, which makes me feel good. I finally got the right. It feels right because it's an emergency. But then the tagline is conversations for a future we want and our kids deserve. So it hints at positive, which I try to always do. I interview the solutionaries. Thanks for being such a great one, for being on this beat for so long. And yes, please subscribe. Go to YouTube at Betsy Rosenberg Interviews because there's a couple of other Code Greens, mostly hospital medical related. Uh, and tell everybody you know, because I keep starting over on different platforms and I can't get a sponsor until we get 1,000 subscribers. And, it takes a while. There's so much noise out there and good noise, so many podcasts and other things. The problem is, and we'll end here as I see it, is in the green world, in the climate world, and online especially, there is so much coverage, and I'm overwhelmed. I can't keep up with the beat, if you will. But then corporate media, you almost never hear it mentioned, especially now with all the distractions, right? And
Right.
it comes in last on the list of issues in every state that voters are concerned about, except California. Like why are we still in this? Why are we still stuck in this when there's just so much reason to, have much greater concern about this?
Yep. Well, I appreciate everything you're doing, and it's fun to
Thanks.
reconnect with you.
All right. We'd love to be on your webcast someday. As you see, I have too much to talk about.
We can get at some of
Let's
these
do that,
issues too.
especially
Yeah.
when it comes to disinformation, working on trying to sue Fox because they're continuing to lie about climate change. That impacts how people evacuate or don't, how they build their homes or don't. Plenty of people who've been victims because they thought it was a hoax. Maybe there's a public interest lawsuit there. One of the things I'm pursuing
Good.
my spare time. Thank you so much, Andy, for making
Sure.
yourself available. Yeah, I encourage everybody, in addition to subscribing to Code Green, to watch Sustain What. He always has great guests, usually a panel uh, of topics that really should be of interest to everybody. Same with Code Green. That's the point,
Great.
right? This is not
Yep.
just for environmentalists, it's for everybody else that
For sure.
needs and hopefully will want to know more as we go
All right.
further down the abyss. Okay.
Take care.
Thank you. You too.